Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to our panel. This morning's panel is titled The Future of Transportation in Africa, Evolutionary or Revolutionary. I'm Jerome Lynch. I'm the Donald Malloy Department Chair of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Given the relevance and the importance of mobility on my profession, I've been asked to moderate this session today. And it's a great honor for me to serve as moderator and to be able to share the stage, if you will, with the leaders of the mobility space as we unpack questions around the future of mobility on the African continent. Undoubtedly, it's a very exciting time for mobility in Africa. Today, Africa is roughly 1.3 million people in 54 different countries, but by mid-century it's projected that that population may double. It's also an emerging market for mobility and mobility services, with many today in the industry drawing parallels to other emerging markets that emerged over the past few decades, including China, where today we see China as one of the largest automotive and mobility markets in the world. So there's similar promise for Africa. We've already seen significant early investments in part of Africa in terms of the automotive sector, ranging from BMW, for example, in South Africa, all the way to Renault Nissan in Morocco, and other car companies aiming to enter the African market, both for manufacturing and sales in the coming years. Also, African nations are quite young with a very strong entrepreneurial spirit. This dynamic environment provides a significant level of innovation and entrepreneurialism that's necessary to bring forth new mobility solutions to the market and to explore new business models that may go with those mobility solutions. Also, given the rapid advancement of technology, there's tremendous opportunity for technology to also offer African countries leapfrog capabilities on how they invest in transportation and mobility services within their own communities. So to unpack these very complex questions, we're honored to have an illustrious panel with us this morning. So I'm going to begin by introducing each panelist before allowing each of them to provide their own opening remarks. So I'm going to do this also in alphabetical order. So we're honored to have as our first panelist, Edward Hightower, who's currently the Managing Director of Motoring Ventures and is the author of a book called Motoring Africa, Sustainable Automotive Industrialization. It's a book I actually consulted to prepare for today's panel, so a fantastic read for those that are interested. Edward has had a long career in the automotive sector, spending significant time at General Motors, BMW, and Ford. And he's also currently serving as an alumni in residence here at the University of Michigan in our Ross School of Business. And we've invited Edward to serve on today's panel because he's able to speak to many of the trends that we see in the industry and also share with us some of his thoughts on how fast technology will be adopted in the African market with respect to transportation and mobility services. Our second panelist is Titus Kimbawa, who's the business team operation lead for a startup company in Uganda called Zembo. He's a seasoned entrepreneur who has a degree in economics from the University of Washington. And we've invited Titus to join our panel today, and we're honored to have him to gain some insight to the entrepreneurial community that exists in many of the African countries, particularly his experiences with Zembo, which is an upstart scooter company in Uganda that's looking at heavy investment in both infrastructure as well as new mobility services based on scooters. Our third panelist that we're honored to have is Professor Henry Liu, who's the Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at the University of Michigan. Professor Liu is also the director of our Center for Connected and Autonomous Transportation here at the university. We've invited Professor Liu to join our panel to be able to speak to some of the smart technologies that we're seeing, namely connectivity and automation that's certainly being explored and adopted globally. Quite interested in learning how those technologies can be transformative with respect to future investments in mobility services in the African continent. Finally, we're also honored to have Darren Van Mali, who's the Current Affairs Director for Africa and also the Executive Director of South Africa for Ford Motor Company. Darren has been with Ford for nearly 20 years, moving through their executive ranks, primarily focused on Africa and the markets that exist in various African countries. I'll also note that he's a non-executive director at the Tshwane Automotive Special Economic Zone as well. And we've invited Darren to join our panel to provide us with real insight to how industry players are viewing opportunity within the African market. So as you can see, this is an illustrious panel, and we're quite honored to have them with us this morning. So I'm going to now turn it over to each panelist to essentially say a number of opening remarks. And I'll begin with Edward. Edward?
Okay, well, thank you, Jerome. Good evening, everyone. I'm Edward Hightower, Managing Director of Motoring Ventures, and as Jerome said, the author of Motoring Africa. I'm based in Detroit, but I'm actually joining you this evening from Kampala, Uganda, where I'm visiting a client of mine, Kira Motors Corporation, which is a late-stage manufacturer of electric city buses. And first of all, I just wanted to thank the University of Michigan for inviting me to participate in this panel today. This is a topic that I have a great deal of passion about and have for quite some time. But the way I look at it is, whether the future of personal transportation is, ride sharing, city buses, vehicle sharing, last mile solutions, the real opportunity, as I see it, is in the manufacturing of the vehicles themselves, the manufacturing and the production of the vehicles themselves. Because as we just heard, the African continent has a population of about 1.3 billion people. However, that's about 17.5% of the world's population. But on the continent, only about 1% of the world's vehicles are produced. You compare that to the country alone of China, which has a similar population of about 1.3 billion to the African continent, where they produce about 30% of the world's vehicles. So there's a significant opportunity as these markets grow, as the population works towards doubling by 2050, and as the workforce grows to be the largest workforce in the world by 2035, there's an opportunity to localize the value chain, localize the supply chain, and to produce more of these vehicles in market where the consumers are. I mean, the African continent represents one of the fastest growing markets in the world, and the automotive supply chain represents a significant opportunity for economic development and industrialization to drive industrialization in these markets. From my experience, leading vehicle programs in the industry, there are about 30,000 parts in a vehicle, and about 70% of them are built outside, by outside suppliers, if you will, not by VW, not by Ford, not by Toyota, but by an outside supplier. And those suppliers tend to create 4 to 5 times the number of jobs as the automakers themselves. So the opportunities for driving industrialization, creating skilled workforce, driving sustainable economic development are really a big opportunity with localization of vehicle manufacturing and the supply chain. All of those 30,000 parts have to be stamped, cast, forged, plastic injection molded, coated, painted, and all of those skills that go into making all of those components end up being transferable to many other industries, whether it be medical devices, consumer durables, or other industrials. So localization creates an opportunity for other industries as well. And many African governments, like Uganda's, recognize the opportunity and the benefits of industrialization, and they're supporting the creation and the development of the automotive sector. And I look forward to discussing this on this panel today. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Edward. Really appreciate those opening remarks. Okay, so I'm now going to turn it over to Titus, who's going to talk to us a little bit about his startup company and entrepreneurial climate in Uganda. Titus.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on the panel to discuss everything that's happening here in Uganda regarding transportation and all the entrepreneurs happening, all the entrepreneur action that's happening here. First, I want to thank Jerome and the University of Michigan for having me. It's an honor. So an honor to be surrounded by also folks like Edward and Mr. Van Melle to be on this panel. They have so much knowledge, and I look forward to learning from them. Also, just sharing some of my experience here. As you introduced me, I have been in many different companies, early stage companies, building in the US, mainly Seattle and San Francisco. But I decided to move back to Uganda to my roots, which is where I was born, and I got excited at all the happenings here and everything that that needed to be built. So I took hold here, and I came across a company called Zembo, ran by Daniel and ATN, who are French and German nationals. And I took interest in it, and I joined to help them expand their operations and really build the company. So as you mentioned, the biggest thing I can share on here is the on foot of a small company working alongside, working in an environment like where you have a company like Kira, which is a big company, late stage, building buses and other electric vehicles, while we have an electric motorcycle that is used for taxis. I'm excited to give you the insights on what's happening regarding that, from the challenges and all the opportunities ahead for it.
Great. Thank you, Thijs. We're looking forward to hearing more about Zembo as well. Okay, our third panelist is Professor Henry Liu. So Henry, if you could share with us your opening remarks specific to technology and technology opportunities potentially in Africa.
Sure. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone. As Jerry mentioned, my name is Henry Liu. I'm a professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I also direct the Center for Connected Automated Transportation. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss technology opportunities for mobility in Africa. Before I talk about the technology opportunity for Africa, I want to start with what I think the future transportation will look like mostly from Western countries, particularly in the US. What we will see in any of the transportation systems, there's three major components. One is the people who are using the transportation systems, and then the vehicles, as well as the infrastructures. What I see in the last 10 years also, the travelers become smarter. What you see is we use a lot of smartphones. Everybody has a smartphone, and smartphone has many applications on it, and some of these are related with transportation, particularly on ride sharing and mapping and navigation and things like that. And we also see from the vehicle perspective, the vehicle become more connected as well as automated, and the vehicle will be able to talk to each other and then talk to the infrastructure as well. And AI has a great application in automated driving, and that's happening in many parts of the world in terms of technology development. We're also seeing rapid development in terms of infrastructure technologies, and given what's happening in the vehicle world as well as in the personal usage or personal demand for transportation, we see what's happening in infrastructure and become from the independent infrastructure systems without any connection to either trailer or vehicles become more cooperative vehicle highway systems, and they are communicating with vehicles, they're communicating with trailers, and so providing the backbone to the transportation systems. And all of that is powered also by the AI and big data, cloud computing, and all of these are the backbone of the technologies for what's happening in the transportation systems. So that's what's happening right now, particularly in the last 10 years also. And I see these are also technology drivers for mobility applications in Africa as well. And as Jerry mentioned, that Africa has a large population and is also rapidly growing. And also with urbanization within the Africa continent, and by 2030, 50% of the Africans will be in urban cities. And we also see mega city is emerging in the past 10 years, and a number of cities become more than 10 million population. And we also see still a large percent of the daily trips are made by non-motorized mode, basically by either walking or by bicycles. And so that also drive in terms of how future transportation technology will apply in Africa. And we also see inadequate public transportation system. Many people still don't have access to public transportation. And in the cities, we also see the traffic jams and the delays in the traffic system. And one particularly important thing related with traffic systems in Africa is high accident rate per capita, and that's probably the highest globally in all the continents. So I think these are the technology drivers, and coupled together with what I see in the future transportation technologies. And so I'll talk a little bit in terms of what I can tell in terms of opportunities, particularly from technology perspective. And we also see technology, rapid adoption of smartphones, and the smartphone adoption will create tremendous opportunity for transportation and as well as mobility. And for example, ride sharing, and we see a number of ride sharing companies or ride hailing companies has emerging in Africa. And because the capability of utilizing smartphone to connect the transportation demand and supply. And I think the bike sharing is still largely unexplored, although Tyler's talk about Zumbo, and I am very happy to see the scooters and e-bicycles are emerging in that market. And with smartphones, people will have better access in terms of travel information, and so that they become more informed in terms of either the available transportation mode or the current status of the transportation, the traffic flow. On the smart vehicle side, I see the electrification and automation are also the trend, not only for the Western world, but also for the Africa. And this is particularly, I think this is particularly important for ride sharing networks. And in my current capacity as a professor and in the last couple of years, I also took a leave of absence working in a company called Didi in China. And that experience tells me electrification actually has, particularly electrical vehicles, has a lot of applications in ride sharing networks. And at least in China, a large percent of the electrical vehicles are actually on Didi networks. And that's a ride sharing company. And so electrical vehicles will have a lot of applications, a lot of usage on ride sharing platform companies, and mostly because these companies will have better usage comparatively with personal usage of electrical vehicle. These company will have better information and better handle in terms of the energy consumption and charging and so on. So and low-cost personal vehicles, particularly motorcycle, will still continue to grow. That's what I will see in Africa, because the low car ownership currently in Africa. And just like a telephone network, I also see a huge opportunity there for shared mobility as well as mobility as a service. And because of the car ownership is still low at the moment, and so in the future, the stage of personal owning a car may be skipped into directly into a mobility as a service type of situation. And the last thing I want to mention is on the infrastructure. And in the large, by and large, in Africa, the road network is not still under development. And so the government investment on road infrastructure still plays an important role in mobility improvement. One thing I do want to mention is that with the new technology on smartphones, as well as connected automated vehicles. And I also see this produce new technology solutions to infrastructure management without heavy investment from the infrastructure perspective. So I just draw example from my past experience with Didi, and when I was in Didi, I developed this business unit called Smart Transportation Business Unit. Basically, it is trying to utilize the Didi vehicles, the vehicles on Didi network as a mobile sensor to capture the traffic flow information, and then to utilize that information to manage the traffic control devices. And this has been applied not only in China, but also in other countries, for example, Brazil and Mexico. And I show you the picture I show you. This is Didi's deployment in Mexico, in Puebla City. And so what you see here is for those utilizing those vehicles on Didi network as a mobile sensors, and they're trying to show you for all of the intersections, what are the current status of these intersections without instrumentation of infrastructure sensors. And so that save a lot of the government investment money, and you can utilize that money to invest on other like public transportation. So so I do see technology present solutions and on the infrastructure investment as well. So with that, I'm going to stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to now turn it to Darren Van Mully, who's going to share with us his opening remarks from the perspective of an industry executive based in South Africa. Darren?
Hi, thanks, Professor Lynch. Appreciate the opportunity to participate on this panel, and also to the university to extend this invitation. I've got a bit of a different approach regarding where we're heading into Africa. And I think in consulting with various organizations in preparing for this panel, I think instinctively, it's been revolutionary, but really it's been evolutionary of a change in order for us to establish a strong economic footprint within Africa. So let me just start off by saying, I try to answer the question is how did we as an industry grow and have been managed to establish a 97-year presence in Africa, and more specifically in South Africa. To provide the context, in 1923, we built the first Model T in Port Elizabeth. We've grown from a low volume, multi-derivative line, and towards the end of early 2010, we progressed towards a high volume, single platform line, predominantly domestically centric, moving towards exports and leveraging our exports into the UK, Europe. The key enablers, specifically from a South African context, before I talk about the rest of Africa, and why automotive has been such a successful program representing 7.7% of the current SA GDP, has been for two key reasons. We have a strong automotive policy, a longevity on the policy, plus we have strong trade policies, more specifically around the free trade agreement with Europe. That marriage has created a very successful export program that does not just applicable to Ford, but other large global OEMs that are based in the market. The eventuality of decades worth of effort, work, tweaking, maneuvering around the pillars that are required and some of the infrastructure that we needed. In 2nd of February this year, some of you might be aware, we've actually made an announcement of just over $1 billion investment in South Africa. In addition to that investment, which is targeting building our future commercial vehicles, we've also managed to develop a strong public-private partnership with the South African government to introduce two new concepts that we as Ford has developed and supported the conceptualization. One is the Tshwane Automotive Special Economic Zone, which is a 200-hectare development. And we've also most recently, through President Ramaphosa, the announcement of a high freight deep water port in the Eastern Cape. And the combination of this allows us then to leverage the infrastructure and the base to now maximize the opportunities of the African Free Trade Agreement. So as a collective, you look at where Ford has been in South Africa in the auto sector, you have seen a strong progression towards export-centric, but we needed the base and the foundation to motivate and to justify the astronomical investments that you are currently seeing within the sector. When we look into the African continent, this is where there's a lot of excitement. At the same time, there's a bit of conservativeness in terms of how do we approach. But right now, the opportunity is that there's a motorization rate of 45 vehicles for every 1,000 people in Africa. The average rate globally is 203 vehicles for every 1,000. Africa, and I think it was mentioned by the previous panelist, Edward, is that pretty much a young, rapidly increasing middle class with a low motorization rate, and predominantly majority of the vehicles coming that are sourced in Africa are used vehicles, about 80%. Vehicles in Africa represent, for 1.3 billion people on the continent, only 1.1 million is new vehicles, and that is estimated to double beyond 2030. As we look, and being one of the founding members of the African, the AAM and African Association, in addition, being one of the decision makers and supporting a African expansion from an automotive perspective, what we started to see is very, very interesting and somewhat sometimes exciting sentiments coming out of government from various key markets on the continent, including the African Union with the introduction of the AfCFTA. And what we like about this, the sentiments are around how do we take a current environment that does not have manufacturing, how do we grow the local manufacturing base, and how do we increase localization? But that leads me then to where do we see, what are some of the key enablers? I mean, early this year, the AfCFTA, the African Free Trade Agreement, was ascended into use as of January 2021. What are the AfCFTA is going to be able to unlock at a macro level is access to 1.3 billion people, 3 trillion in GDP contribution. And fundamentally, it's going to allow the intra-Africa and the ease of intra-Africa trade across the 54 countries. United Nations Economic Commission anticipate that this is going to double intra-Africa trade. Either way, I am quite optimistic that there is going to be substantial intra-Africa trade. The benefits that we are starting to see is that there's a collective decision-making power. It's African leaders, and we got to give these African leaders a lot of a recognition for the efforts to support the ascension of the AfCFTA to unlock economies of scale. The key enablers that we are working on right now, to support the AfCFTA, we have something called a Pan-African Autopack, identifying key strategic markets in which we could produce components and vehicles, leverage those strategic locations to allow other African markets to participate in the partnership in the value chain, either through some of their economic communities, through the RECs, or some other avenues just because of the geographical location on the east and west. The key enablers is policy stability. We're working with governments to look at how best do we create an inclusion for the auto sector and the value chain. And we're looking at hub and spoke models. How can we create an inclusion where we could produce vehicles in a location like in East Africa and with the surrounding countries export, but also have them participate in the value chain? Mobility and connectivity is critical. The question is, how do we bring those new technologies into a market which is very, very sensitive on pricing? And this is where some of us have been working together with the other industry players on how best to look at some of these introductions so that we could have a true industrialization on the continent. In conclusion, I think I strongly believe Africa will approach an evolutionary strategy, mainly due to the ability to set the right foundation so that they could springboard into a future more industrialized auto sector and in support of moving people freely between borders, equipment, and investments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Darren, and thank you to all the panelists for their opening remarks. Let me sort of ask maybe the first question, and this is more directed toward Darren and Ed. And the question is, you speak to sort of the current landscape that exists in the African market. You emphasize the need for localization, industrialization, and localization of essentially the supply chains. I think there's many success stories on the continent, South Africa, and then more recently Morocco being two of them. How about other parts of the continent? Can you share some insights to where else do you see tremendous opportunity in Africa, other countries, to essentially industrializing, be able to capture the market in terms of the manufacturing of vehicles? So what other parts of Africa do you see sort of as very promising spots for future investment in industrialization and localization of supply chain that can lead to the manufacture of vehicles?
Well, I don't mind starting. Jerome, in addition to that, in addition to South Africa and Morocco, Southern Africa and Northern Africa, there's opportunities in East and West Africa. The most important part for the auto sector to grow is the ability to develop scale. And the most important thing to develop scale is the presence of a sizable market. And if you look at East Africa or West Africa, you're looking at markets that are at least 300 to 400 million people, and in several major cities, several port cities that would support the lower cost logistics of transportation of parts and finished vehicles into and out of the continent. And several governments that are ready and eager to support localization and industrialization. And as Darren said, the presence of not only regional trade pacts, but the recently implemented African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So.
A question I have also is, does it matter whether it's cars being manufactured for the local market versus export? I believe in the case of South Africa and BMW, they've exported a lot of their manufactured cars to overseas markets, including, I believe, North America. Does it matter with respect to building that capacity to manufacture, whether it's a strategy built around selling those vehicles to your local market versus exporting them to overseas markets?
Well, there's always an advantage if you could sell to the local market and export. If you look at other recently industrialized automotive nations, I'll take two that I've had the opportunity to work in, South Korea and Mexico. South Korea exports all over the world. And Mexico has trade agreements with, I believe the last count was like 46 countries around the world, specifically for the export of automobiles. So, lean manufacturing principles suggest that it is best to build where your market is. And these are markets that have not had as much investment and focus as much focus as South Africa and Morocco over the last probably 10 years, but South Africa for a much longer period of time. But the opportunities are there, sizable markets, and just waiting for investors to take strong interest in.
Darren?
Yeah, I think to unlock the localization, we've had lengthy discussions with many individual governments. I think to Ed's point, first of all, we got to unlock the region. I think West and East Africa has tremendous amount of value and volume and access to the market. If you look at, I think 60% of intra-Africa trade exists within sub-Saharan Africa. East and West has great opportunities, but you got to unlock the volume. Now, if you take some believe, and some African governments believe, we got to localize first before we can get assembly. I hold a different view. I think we got to first ensure we can get the base right. We can support low-level manufacturing, ensure that we have strong government policies to buy local, drive the volume up progressively. And once we get to a certain pivot point, it could unlock the ability to export within regional countries. So if we take East Africa, and if we pick a country, I'm very hesitant to call it a country. We are working with some key countries in Africa, but if you could produce within that market and export within surrounding markets with robust order policy, you generate economies of scale. Then you can progress further into deepening investment, unleashing the localization value chain. We hold the view that you got to have a strong manufacturing base before we can progress to localization. The supplies will come if we as OEMs enter the market. And same for West Africa. Similar to Edward, I really believe that East and West Africa has a great ability to unlock volume on condition, and it's very critical that we have strong public-private partnership with government. We have a legislative environment that is conducive. Sometimes we must be careful that we become too ambitious to want to include everything in the legislation. You want to jump into EVs, you want to jump into new technology. Fundamentally, we don't have the skills or the technical expertise on the ground to build the foundation. And that's why, for me, we could go faster later, but we just need to go a bit slower to be more progressive and to unlock economies of scale in Africa.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, changing topics just a little bit and shifting away from automotive and for a moment toward mobility services. Titus, I wanted to ask you if you'd be willing to share with the audience sort of the story of Zembo, which I believe stands for Zero Emission Motorcycle Boda. To me, when I read about the story of Zembo, I got pretty excited, both because it represented sort of novel solutions to micromobility at a very local scale. But it also had an infrastructure element to it as well, where there's an investment in solar charging stations and things like that for electric motorcycles. So I thought maybe you could share the story of Zembo with the audience and talk a little bit about how that path has been, both trying to introduce a new mobility service as well as investing in infrastructure to support that mobility service.
Yes, sure. Thanks for that. The story of Zembo is quite simple and pretty funny if you ask me. But Etienne and Daniel, who, as I mentioned, French and German nationals, they met here. Actually, they met in Tanzania in early 2000, I think 17. And by 2018, they came up with the concept of Zembo. The main reason behind that was Daniel was working a lot here in Uganda and building working for a solar company here and building solar systems across Uganda. And he saw how ubiquitous these motorcycle bodas were, which are essentially motorcycle taxis. This is how people move around the city. The infrastructure of Uganda is not very robust. Therefore, the traffic jam is very persistent. So the fastest way to get around the city is using these motorcycle taxis. Now, the unfortunate bit of this is that all of them are gas powered. They're all they cause a lot of pollution here. Him coming from a background of solar, he said, these all need to turn into EVs. So he discussed it with ATN, and they came up with the concept, designed the bike, and by 2000, we launched in 2009. We launched later on, and are now having around 100. And we're coming close to 130 bikes on the road with 15 charging stations around Greater Kampala. Now, the charging stations are what makes this EV, as you know, the cost of having electric mobility is quite high, especially on the battery side. But when you remove costs the upfront cost of the battery from the cost of the vehicle, and just have the battery become a service. Sell the battery as a service, then it becomes much cheaper, in which it then works out for the market here. So this is the concept that brings in. This is how the concept of having the stations around Kampala works out. So whenever somebody is riding on this in their electric motorcycle and they're low on energy, they come and swap and switch a battery for one that is fully charged, and they just have to pay for whatever they used. That's much cheaper than them buying the full cost of the battery. So that's the story of Zembo, and we are the first ones in Uganda. And I think if I'm not mistaken, we are the biggest network of charging stations for mobility in Africa. So we're just going to continue building on top of it, and hopefully have all the electric motorcycle. All the boda bodas in Kampala and really Uganda be electric.
Yeah, so, Ed and Darren talked quite a bit about the important role that government plays, investing in automotive. And I think the same may hold true in the mobility space. How much engagement in Kampala or Uganda has there been with the government with respect to those investments in infrastructure? Has that been something that's entirely done by Zembo, or is there a partnership with the local government to make the installation of those 15 charging stations possible?
Yes, regarding the charging stations, it's mostly been us, but we have definitely now partnered with the government, specifically KCCA, which is the council that governs the city, the main city of Kampala. They have invested in a charging station, so we provided all the materials for it, and they fully own it. And we train local youth here that are within KCCA has local youth groups, which they send our way. We train them, and they get to run the station. They learn about the technology. They learn about how to run a full station. So maybe later on, the whole goal is to have the youth group then come from that with the skills that they've gained to go build their own station, if the opportunity arises. So it is the government is definitely has supported us in that way, and we look forward to even deeper integration with the government to really cement this EV infrastructure as part of their plans.
Great, thank you. The next question that I'm going to ask before we turn it over to Q&A with the audience is more directed toward Henry. Henry, being sort of at the forefront of technology development with connectivity and autonomy, having familiarity from an infrastructure perspective, what it takes to deploy signaling technologies to bring order to roads, particularly in the African market, where we have a number of cities that are rapidly densifying, and we really see issues of road congestion, things like that. What do you see as the opportunity for the technology to address essentially some of those challenges to make mobility a more convenient service, if you will, in African cities? And what do you see as sort of the investment strategy that local governments should have with respect to investing in more traditional type infrastructure solutions for managing their roads, to leapfrogging right to connectivity and potential autonomy?
My comments to this is smartphone adoption is really a big driver. And that changed a lot of things, and not only just from personal use of smartphone, but also enable better connection between the transportation supply and as well as demand, and not only that, but also gave better information to the travelers and better information to the government agencies in terms of what's happening on the road and how to manage that. And I think this does present. To me, I think this does present a leapfrog solution to transportation management, not only from the government perspective, but also from the trawlers' perspective. And I still go back to the example I used in my opening remark, that In the past, when we managed the traffic control devices to reduce the traffic jam, we tend to install a lot of equipment, sensors on the road by means of cameras or loop detectors or radar sensors, trying to detect traffic flow, trying to measure what's happening, and then from that, we can optimize in terms of traffic control devices. And by adoption of smartphones, because of the usage of smartphone, and particularly differentiate those smartphones inside of the vehicle versus those in the household, then we have a better understanding of traffic flow. Just utilize these smartphones as a mobile sensor. So without installing anything on the road, and the vehicle itself become a mobile sensor, and just utilize that, you can actually derive in terms of traffic control, traffic flow performance, and as well as optimize traffic signals. And so the cost to implement those is only really a fraction of the cost to the available technology or existing currently existed. And that gave you a lot of advantages, and one of these is not only you don't need to install, but also this gives you access to a large area. It's because it's spread out. It's not really concentrated just a couple of intersections, and you have a large area which you can manage to reduce the congestion. So I do think these technology will present some revolutionary type of solutions, just like landline telephone network, and it's not going to be in most of the developing countries. They probably not going to be utilized. Instead, people will tend to use use mobile phones, and to a certain extent in the mobility world, I think this will be happening as well. And there are some of these technologies will leapfrog to the new situation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Henry. Okay, so I'm going to take a few questions from the audience. You already have a few questions that have been populated on the Q&A panel. So I'm going to pick one or two and then kind of go from there. So the first one is a question with respect to ride-hailing companies and ride-hailing services in African communities. Particularly the question that the attendee has is given the dominance of informal transit, does ride hailing really match up with the reality on the ground in African communities? What is the potential for ride hailing? What are some of the challenges that are there given that informal transit culture that may exist in many communities on the continent? So that's anyone is free to answer that.
I can touch on that a bit. One thing about the ride hailing, and this is something that has worked in not worked, but rather it's been implemented here in Uganda, specifically Kampala. Uber's here. There's also an app called SafeBoda, which is essentially an Uber specific for motorcycle taxis. The way the motorcycle taxis work today without the ride-hailing apps is that you come out to the street, or maybe somebody that has a motorcycle right by where you live, and you call them, or you go out to the street, you wave your hand, and they come pick you up, and you go where you need to go. There is and one thing about there's a host of problems that come along with that. One being safety, the other being the pricing. You can, unless you are a local, unless you are somebody that has done the route before, you wouldn't know the price of that route, whatever route you are taking. What these ride-hailing apps provide is that sense of price discovery, so you know exactly what the price is for that ride. The other thing is, of course, safety. Which is what they usually, guarantee first before even the price, is the guaranteeing of safety, knowing that you're riding with somebody who is being who has a GPS tracker on them and who is also known by the ride-hailing company. So they definitely bring some organization within this informal market, and it's something that we have also ourselves on us from Zembo's standpoint. We've gone out, we've reached out to these companies and really tried to get more bikes within that type of setting versus the informal side, as the operations of these the operational guidelines of these hailing apps is a little more stricter than the informal. So you did risk having an electric bike, which is novel, to end up in an unfortunate situation. So I think they definitely provide those two things. Of course, it is also, they still.
We'll just give Titus a moment to come back. All right, I'm gonna just take another question from. Yeah, go ahead, Henry. If you'd like to share that, please. By all means.
I can add to Titus. Yeah, I think I agree with Titus, and I would draw a comparison between the informal transit situation sort of 10 years ago in China versus right now in China. And 10 years ago, before Didi emerged into the market, what you will see is this black market, and people actually, without any formalization, without any apps, they will go into these to get the ride, to these driver to get the ride. So a lot of safety issues emerged, and with adoption of cell phone, mobile internet, really, I think, connect these demand and supplies and make this mobility as a service better. And this will, again, this will have a culture shift as well. And right now in China, it's probably very difficult for you to just to get the informal transit, to just walk to somebody and somebody just at the roadside to get a ride. You just have to utilize some sort of apps and to do so. So I think this will, again, this will stimulate and also encourage the culture shift to mobility as a service.
Okay, great. One of the questions that the attendees posed was the translation of ride-hailing solutions for mobility from urban areas to more rural areas of Africa. Certainly here in North America, I think ride-hailing companies like Uber and others first penetrated more denser urban areas to essentially offset some of the costs of their infrastructure, and have only recently begun to really go beyond some of these more urban service areas. What is the case of Africa? How far can mobility services like ride-hailing sort of get outside of the cities and benefit more rural communities in African countries? Any thoughts on that?
Well, Jerome, what I would add is that, the African continent is becoming urbanized, just like many parts of the world as well. And what's essential is having the right solution, whether it's a heavily urban market, whether it's a last mile solution, or whether there's a rural market. And I think the technology, brought on by apps, et cetera, is just creating an opportunity for entrepreneurs to deliver the right solution for that particular customer's need and that particular environment that they're in, whether it be rural, last mile, or urban.
Great.
To me, I think for ride-hailing companies, these are for-profit companies. It will be difficult for them to penetrate these really rural areas because profitability. So I think in the rural area, the government investment from public investment on those is still, or subsidized such service will be still critical to provide service and to provide access for people to the road network.
Yeah, I agree with Henry on this one, especially when you start progressing out of these main metropolitans. The volume, the business equation for the individual small entrepreneur who's going to have to create these solutions for such long distances to move out. I think maybe it's going to be up to a creative entrepreneur to provide that, but government policy, government legislation, moving people, high volume of people is going to probably be a better solution. But individual mobility is just going to be very tough. I mean, I've been in a few countries now within Africa. While you're in the center, you've got huge volumes. You may have infrastructure challenges in terms of traffic and in terms of congestion. But as you move to the outskirts, it just leans out significantly. And so that individual entrepreneur's business equation may need to have other support, especially government support.
It's great input on that. Okay, another question from the audience, and this changes gears a little bit and moves us more into the realm of financing. What does the panel believe, is the future for alternative financial instruments in Africa? Specifically, the panelist mentions cryptocurrencies. Given the very tax-savvy young population in many African countries, we do see Bitcoin in use in certain parts of the African market. But can you speak broadly in terms of the role of any sort of cryptocurrency, essentially reinforcing some of the currencies on the continent and being integral to mobility solutions going forward? Do you also see opportunities for blockchain in your industry, which goes beyond, now financing and maybe more as a trust network, say between, contracts between suppliers and things like that? Can you speak to cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the opportunities that exist in Africa for their use?
I'm going to come in first, and I'm sure the panelists will add to this, but I think financing is incredibly critical. North of South African borders, the ability for individuals to fund is very difficult, to get credit, even to be able to acknowledge credit. In addition, is there dispute mechanisms in play through default? And so this variability and risk becomes really apparent and really difficult for banking institutions and other forms of financing opportunities. As part of some of the discussions that I'm having with key banking leaders and execs around what do we do in Africa, specifically around the West and East Africa, without unlocking financing, I don't think so you can unlock economies of scale. I believe those are critical towards scale. The challenge is how do we figure out the financing options? Most of the financing options now, when you have to incorporate risk and you have to incorporate the variability of consistency and the uncertainty of accountability and a scheduled payment regimen, the interest payments are very high. I would really love to find solutions as to how do we overcome this, because in my sector and other sectors, it will actually help with the industrialization and it will be a catalyst. So from that perspective, at 100,000 foot level, I need the financing. We're really looking for options as to how this could be. Could it be a solution internally or externally? I don't have a position in terms of crypto as to which mechanism would be, but we really need to unlock. That would be really the next level to allow the progression of financing. Similar to South Africa, we have financing. We could see what has happened. Africa is just becoming, it's the next level that is just uncertain, and we're looking for as to how do we finance product.
Yeah, and I think that, experiences that we've seen also in other parts of the world where blockchain becomes sort of an underlying infrastructure for providing sort of a platform for financing, particularly smaller but aggregated financing that gets to scale. Particularly filling vacuums that are often left in countries that may not have a central bank, for example, and the need to invest in infrastructure and things like that. So I agree that there's probably an exciting opportunity there to look at these technologies, these fintech sort of solutions to bring in financing to the equation. I don't know, Titus or Henry, from a technology perspective, how those innovations may be tied directly to these mobility service solutions. Do you see me there?
From a technology standpoint, I don't know. I don't think there will be much of it, but as Darren mentioned, it's going to be it could be useful in the financing side. As again, echoing Darren, it's very, 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 very hard to find credit north of South Africa because it's just it's a very, very primitive financial sector here. But I think it will get opened up as more secured types of loans are able to be given out. It's just there's no you can't walk into a bank and get a loan as easy as you may be able to elsewhere. It's really, really hard to do that. But if cryptocurrencies do provide some type of security, or at least overstep, leapfrog some part of the financial setup here, in which it's easier to give out a loan and know that this is the, at least read or give out a loan to somebody where you know that this is the chance that they'll pay back. But there's just so many gaps here in giving out loans that you prefer not to give out your bike to somebody. On that, we are financing the bikes, although we have partners who help us with that. But we also do in-house financing for bikes. Motorcycle taxi drivers do not have the money to do it, so we have to finance them. So as part of that, we do our credit check, which is essentially just go ask who knows them, and who is the village council there who can guarantee them. Not very similar to other ways that at least credit is done, and it's a very, very primitive way to give out credit, and it can be but if cryptocurrencies in whatever solution comes out of them is able to offer a solution to open up credit more, then without increasing risk or really de-risking the portfolio, then yes, I think it has a huge role to play in the future of transportation here.
Great.
Yes.
Darren.
Hey, sorry, Prof. Just a point to raise in addition to what Titus has said. If you look at the latest United Nations report on used vehicles, 14 million vehicles were sold by 2014 for 16, I think 17, averaging $8,300 a vehicle. So there is interest. There are revenue opportunities for financial institutions. I think the ability to move away from the current model in terms of, and to be able to be more open to a different form of risk could be an opportunity for these financial institutions to support both business, but also to generate the revenues that they need, trying to accommodate the current volatility and the current cultural differences within on credit in Africa.
Great.
And Jerome, to your question on, really brief. I think part of the answer lies somewhere in what Elon Musk is doing. I'm really curious. I'm intrigued by his investment in Bitcoin. He's said he's going to accept him for Tesla purchases, and part of his rationale being to reduce foreign exchange risk within a supply chain. So I plan to follow closely and learn more about what he's up to.
That's a great example, looking at sort of a trendsetter company in the EV market, and their dabble in sort of these cryptocurrencies. So great point. Henry, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to add a quick point that it's may not related with finance itself, but it does related to mobile pay. Mobile pay is a critical enabler for mobility as a service, and I'm sure Zenvol will have experienced that how you deal with mobile pay for your company. that will be very, very important. And for the mobility as a service in terms of vehicle itself, it's also very important, because you don't want a driver to put a bag of money in their car and it become it's not very safe. So mobile pay is actually a critical enabler for that.
Is a great point, and I think we've seen that also in countries like China, right? That's become sort of the standard way of transacting, between parties. All right, so changing gears a little bit, question toward Darren and Ed from an automotive perspective. Climate change, increasing emphasis being placed on governments across the world trying to cut their CO2 emissions. Clearly, the mobility sector today does contribute significant greenhouse gases. What do you see with respect to Africa's future, the adoption of the automobile? Do you see internal combustion engines being sort of the mainstay vehicle, or do you see opportunities for Africa to follow other parts of the world, including the United States, in the adoption of EV? Once you go toward EV, though, you have increasing dependence now on an electrical grid. So it does beg questions around sort of the resiliency of providing those electrical services. What do you see as the path forward as Africa becomes more of an automotive market?
Yeah, I think so. Let's take this in two ways. So we look at our location. So we've in the February 2nd announcement, we've announced that we will be going into what we call island mode, where we will be carbon neutral and utility free from 2024, the entire operation within South Africa. Within Africa, I think it's going to be a while before we absorb electrical vehicles or some solution at scale. The challenge would be not necessarily the ability to include. Sometimes there are infrastructure issues, both in terms of the generation and also the ability of physical infrastructure to be able to charge. But you also have the ability on the price point for now. So for now, I would see ICE, the internal combustible engine, to be predominantly a solution for Africa. It is a price point, and if you look at the importation, one of the things that we've been debating, as EVs become more affordable, the importation of used vehicles could help the introduction of EVs into Africa. Now, I don't know what that's going to look like. We don't have a feel of a vision of what that's going to be, but there are certain opportunities through that segmentation to provide an affordability. Right now, the sensitivity is price. You've got people in the market that would potentially buy these vehicles, but the options could be a hybrid model. It's a bit more expensive, but at least it allows the mitigation of infrastructure challenges, utility generation. So especially with long distances that we travel, between your residence and your work environment, or between cities, it could, Pretoria to Gauteng is about 70 kilometers. So you could have those solutions. I still think we're going to be dependent on ICE vehicles for a little while. But Ford has made announcements globally with regards to the conclusion and the end of internal combustible engine in the future. But I do believe the emerging markets are still going to absorb this. Their motivation is less around the technology, but more around affordability.
Ed, would you like to share as well?
Yes, I agree with Darren when you specifically, especially when you speak about personal use vehicles, there is going to be a price point challenge. However, when you look at the commercial vehicle segment, whether it's ride hailing or ride sharing vehicles or commercial trucks, commercial light vehicles, those vehicles, those purchase decisions tend to look at more of total ownership cost over time. The uptime of those vehicles is significantly higher than a personal use vehicle, which typically sits parked in a garage or at a parking space when you're at work 90 to 95% of the time. So when you have higher uptime and you're looking at an equation based on total ownership experience, with lower maintenance costs, lower fuel costs, and you're looking at a cost of batteries, which continues to decline. I think there are specific markets on the continent that are more ripe for EVs than others. You just have to, do the homework to select the right geographies and select the right sectors. And, the adoption period is going to be slow, just as it has been everywhere else in the world. But I think they are still the future, even on the African continent.
Does Africa have an advantage with respect to natural resources that go into the manufacture of electric vehicle? You talked before about localized supply chains and things like that. Are there materials in Africa that are quite accessible from a natural resource perspective that then would feed a localized supply chain that would feed the EV market in Africa?
Yeah, so that's the investigation, and I think I missed this out in my earlier address. There is opportunity for material. We have the ability, we have a supply base that could localize. Could we absorb at scale? So from my perspective and from our perspective as a business, it's the scalability that's critical in order to have a business equation for production. However, here's an interesting position that we're working with governments and we're working on the policy side, is how do we take this, how do we bring scalability to markets that will sell some vehicles, but not substantial amount? And the one opportunity has been, why don't we produce in these markets with the support of a strong legislative environment? We have, Africa has really good trading agreements and the ability to move product out of the continent. Predominantly, you have the African Growth and Opportunity Act with the US. You have the European Union Economic Partnership Agreement, and there's other agreements that are being discussed. Take that, produce it locally and export. And that could help close the gap for scalability. And that's something that I'm really interested in, and we are really interested to explore. And we've already engaged governments. I got to be very careful on the calling out a country or countries, but that seems to have a lot of momentum. If we can get to 30, 40,000 volume, that provides the ability to leverage those volumes for local industry. And really, to me, that's the low hanging fruit. And that's what we're working on. And that's what I'm focusing on, is to find a complementary approach between exports and domestic volumes for alternative energies. In a traditional vehicle, it's normally you would go the other way. You would take the local support, local domestic market, offset your overheads, and use the base for export.
Right. Great point. Others want to share on that?
I think I want to add on what Edward said. It's when we look with regards to commercial vehicles, these are things that would definitely incentivize the local producers, right? We have, for example, here in Uganda, we have producers of batteries, but they mostly focus on lead acid, or this is the only focus that they do. I don't even think they do dry cell. But with the introduction of buses coming from Kira Motors, along with other products that they're building that are strictly lithium ion, if I'm not mistaken, this should incentivize the local manufacturers to invest into the technology of lithium ion. This have been also our argument with the government here in regards to importing of lithium ion batteries to Uganda. Again, it's the technology transfer, but again, at the same time, it's also an incentive for the local manufacturers to invest into this as the market grows. So once the market then reaches a point where they see that it makes economic sense, then they would easily make that switch or turn on that switch to produce it locally, which I'm sure could be much cheaper than having it transferred from China.
Great. Thank you, Titus. So just being cognizant of time, I think this brings us to a close of the panel. So I wanted to say thank you to the four panelists. This was an absolutely outstanding discussion. I learned a lot. I feel the audience through their questions was able to really come away with a deeper understanding of the opportunities that exist in Africa. So to me, it sounds like there's tremendous opportunity for both evolutionary and revolutionary adoption of mobility services in Africa. So Fantastic sharing all your thoughts on that question today. So thank you very, very much. And thank you particularly to Ed, Darren, and Titus, who I believe it's evening your time in Africa today, right now. So thank you for staying up late for us. So I'm going to turn it over now to Laura, who's going to just close this panel and this morning's session for the conference. Laura?